Behind the explosion of 20th century music lies a harsh reality of stolen legacies. At the center of this is Willie Dixon, the master architect who built the foundation of Chicago blues. Despite composing over 500 classic songs, record labels pushed him into the shadows and exploited his labor with cheap contracts. Refusing to remain silent, he confronted the entire music industry to reclaim the rights to his own creations. His fight for justice did not begin in a courtroom, but in the grueling fields of southern Mississippi. He was born on the 1st of July, 1915, in Vicksburg, Mississippi. The year is critical. It was exactly half a century after the end of the American Civil War, yet the South had successfully engineered a society that closely mimicked the economic and social structures of slavery. Vicksburg was a tough, unforgiving river town. It was a place where the American dream was heavily guarded by Jim Crow laws, where racial terror was a casual instrument of social control, and where a black man's worth was calculated strictly by the physical labor he could produce. Willie was born into a family where tragedy was not an event, but an environment. He was the 7th child of Daisy McKenzie and Charles Dixon, but that number is deceptively optimistic. Daisy would eventually give birth to 14 children. 7 of them died in infancy. This staggering 50% mortality rate was not uncommon for black families in the Mississippi Delta during this era. It was the direct result of systemic medical neglect, severe malnutrition, and crushing poverty. The psychological weight of this reality is difficult to overstate. Willie grew up in a household where death was a constant hovering presence, where bringing a child into the world was a gamble heavily weighted against life. This early exposure to the fragility of existence stripped away any illusions about the fairness of the world. It bred a specific kind of emotional armor, a stoicism that W. would later characterize his approach to both life and business. His father, Charles, was a man locked in the exhausting machinery of Southern industry. He worked at a local sawmill, trading his physical health for pennies in an environment designed to keep laborers perpetually indebted and impoverished. The strain of this existence fractured the marriage. By 1912, Charles had filed for divorce, citing Daisy's infidelity, a process that was finalized in 1913. Another man, Anderson Bell, stepped into the household to become Willie's stepfather. The neighborhood whispers, the quiet gossip that permeates small towns, often suggested that Bell was actually Willie's biological father. Whether true or not, the instability of his paternal figures left Willie to find his core grounding in the one unwavering force in his life. His mother, Daisy McKenzie, was a woman of extraordinary, almost eccentric intellect. In a society that actively suppressed the education and articulation of black women, Daisy developed her own highly sophisticated method of communication. She spoke almost entirely in rhyme. She did not just recite poetry. She processed her daily life through rhythmic couplets. Whether she was issuing a warning about the dangers of the segregated streets, assigning household chores, or expressing affection, she did so in precise, measured verse. To a casual observer, this might have seemed like a harmless quirk, but analytically, it was a profound psychological defense mechanism and a brilliant pedagogical tool. In the Jim Crow South, a black child saying the wrong word or using the wrong tone could result in lethal consequences. Daisy's rhymes were a way of drilling essential survival rules into her children's memories. A rhyming warning is harder to forget. For young Willie, absorbing these rhythms became his primary education. His brain was being meticulously wired for lyricism before he could even read. He learned how to compress complex ideas into simple, memorable cadences. He was inadvertently learning the structural mathematics of songwriting from a woman trying to keep her children alive in a hostile world. This linguistic environment primed him for his first encounters with music. At just 4 years old, Willie began singing in the Springfield Baptist Church. He possessed an anomaly of a voice, a deep resonant bass that sounded unnatural coming from a child. But in the black Southern community, the church was not merely a place of worship. It was the only institution entirely owned and operated by black people. Singing in the choir was an exercise in collective emotional release. It was a safe harbor where the grief of daily subjugation could be transfigured into spiritual triumph. Here, Willie learned that his voice had power. It could command attention, and it could move people. However, the spirituals of the church only captured half of the reality. The other half was secular, raw, and bleeding. When Willie was 7 years old, a local blues pianist named Little Brother Montgomery came through Vicksburg. Willie stood entirely transfixed as he watched the man play. This was not the polished, heaven-bound music of the Sunday choir. This was the blues. It was the sound of the sawmill, the dirt roads, the unpaid debts, and the broken hearts. For a boy raised in the shadows of infant mortality and racial terror, the blues made absolute terrifying sense. It was the language of his reality, finally spoken out loud. As Willie transitioned into his teenage years, his physical stature grew rapidly, making him a prime target for the cruelest economic engine of the South, the county prison farms. After the abolition of slavery, the 13th Amendment left a deliberate, catastrophic loophole. It abolished involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime. The Southern states weaponized this immediately, passing a series of black codes that criminalized mundane behaviors, vagrancy, loitering, or simply being unemployed. Goal was to arrest young, able-bodied black men and lease their labor to private plantations and state-run farms. It was slavery rebranded by the justice system. Willie Dixon did not escape this dragnet. Arrested on minor fabricated charges, he was thrust into the brutal reality of the Mississippi penal farms. Here, the oppression was not abstract, it was physical. He was subjected to back-breaking manual labor under the punishing Delta sun, overseen by armed guards ready to administer severe beatings for the slightest infraction. Yet it was within this hellscape that his true musical education solidified. He did not learn the structure of the blues from sheet music or record players. He learned it from the work songs of the chained men around him. These songs were not designed for entertainment. They were functional, essential tools for survival. The call and response chants set the pace for the swinging of pickaxes and the chopping of wood. If the men moved out of rhythm, someone would get hurt by a tool, or worse, draw the attention of the overseer's whip. The rhythm had to be absolute. The lyrics were improvised expressions of misery, endurance, and quiet defiance. Willie absorbed the profound difference between a song that is performed and a song that is lived. He understood at a cellular level that music could be a mechanism for enduring the unendurable. His salvation from the dirt came in the form of a local carpenter named Theo Phelps. Phelps was a man who recognized the extraordinary depth and control of Willie's bass voice. He took the teenager under his wing, providing the formal musical education that the state of Mississippi had denied him. Phelps taught him the mechanics of vocal harmony, how to construct chords with human voices, and how to control his breathing. More importantly, Phelps brought Willie into a gospel quartet called the Union Jubilee Singers. This was not just a church group. They were a professional outfit that performed regularly on a local Vicksburg radio station, WQBC. The radio was a miraculous piece of technology in the 1930s. For Willie, stepping into the broadcasting booth was a revelation. He realized that his voice could travel beyond the segregated boundaries of his town. He learned stagecraft, the discipline of regular rehearsal, and the crucial concept that his musical talent had tangible commercial value. But as the mid-1930s approached, the tension in Vicksburg became suffocating. Willie was now a giant of a young man, fiercely intelligent, deeply observant, and increasingly intolerant of the daily humiliations required to survive as a black man in Mississippi. The lynching of black men was still a normalized tactic of terror. The economic ceiling was set at manual labor. He looked at the older men around him, men who had broken their bodies for a system that still called them boy, and he realized a hard, undeniable truth. To stay in Mississippi was to accept a slow, agonizing death of the spirit, if not the body. The whispers of the North were growing louder. The Great Migration was underway, a massive demographic shift where millions of black Southerners were boarding trains to cities like Detroit, New York, and Chicago, chasing the promise of industrial jobs and relative freedom. Willie Dixon looked at the train tracks slicing through the Delta. He knew the rhythm of the dirt. He knew the songs of the prison farms. But he also knew he was meant to build something larger than the boundaries of Vicksburg would ever allow. At 21 years old, he made the decision that would alter the course of American music. He was going to run. The decision to flee the South is rarely a romantic adventure. It is an act of desperate self-preservation. When Willie Dixon boarded the northbound train in 1936, he carried nothing of material wealth. His luggage consisted solely of the psychological armor forged in a house of grief, the rhyming vocabulary of his mother, and the heavy, rhythmic echoes of the prison farm work songs. He was leaving behind the explicit physical brutality of the Jim Crow South, hoping to find a promised land in the industrial North. But Chicago was not a sanctuary. It was a different kind of battlefield, a sprawling concrete arena where the exploitation was not enforced by the overseer's whip, but by the quiet, lethal ink of a contract. The giant from Vicksburg was about to step into the ring, both literally and figuratively, and the world was entirely unprepared for his arrival. The train ride from Mississippi to Illinois in 1936 was not a journey toward a utopia. It was an evacuation. When the 21-year-old Willie Dixon stepped off the Illinois Central Railroad and onto the freezing pavement of Chicago, he was instantly confronted with the sheer, overwhelming scale of the industrial North. The Great Migration had fundamentally altered the demographics of the United States. Millions of black Southerners had fled the explicit codified terror of Jim Crow, only to find themselves herded into the invisible red-line boundaries of Chicago's South Side. The Black Belt was a densely packed, aggressively segregated stretch of the city where landlords extracted exorbitant rents for dilapidated, rat-infested apartments. The air tasted of slaughterhouses and steel mills. The physical chains of the South had been removed, but they were immediately replaced by the cold, heavy machinery of northern urban capitalism. Willie Dixon had arrived with nothing but the clothes on his back and a physical frame built by trauma and manual labor. He was a colossal human being, standing 6 feet 6 inches tall and weighing a solid 250 pounds. His body was a visual deterrent. In a city where desperate men fought over scraps of factory work, physical intimidation was a viable currency. But Willie was acutely aware that the factories were just another form of the sawmill that had broken his father. He refused to trade his body to any assembly line. Instead, he looked at the brutal realities of the Chicago streets and made a deeply pragmatic decision. He chose a profession where violence was compensated rather than punished. He entered the boxing ring. Boxing in the 1930s was not merely a sport. It was one of the few legal avenues of upward mobility available to young black men. But it was also a legalized blood sport, an industry built on the physical destruction of desperate youth for the entertainment of paying crowds. Willie walked into the gyms of the South Side and quickly proved he was not just large. He was lethal. He possessed a terrifying combination of heavyweight power and the fast, rhythmic footwork he had inadvertently developed while dodging the overseers on the prison farms. The ring made sense to him. The rules were clear, the objective was straightforward, and the violence was confined to a squared circle. In 1937, Willie entered the prestigious Illinois State Golden Gloves tournament. This was the premier amateur boxing competition in the country, a brutal gauntlet that tested the absolute limits of human endurance. Willie fought his way through the novice heavyweight division, systematically dismantling his opponents with a cold, calculated efficiency. He won the championship. The victory immediately elevated his status. He transitioned into the professional ranks, a move that brought him into the orbit of boxing royalty. He even spent time sparring with the legendary Joe Louis, the man who was carrying the psychological weight of Black America on his shoulders. For a brief, intoxicating moment, it appeared that Willie Dixon's destiny lay in the violent ballet of the prize ring. But the boxing industry was a microcosm of American capitalism. It was engineered to ensure that the men taking the punches rarely kept the money. After fighting 4 professional bouts, Willie began to notice a discrepancy between the purses advertised and the cash placed in his hand. He initiated a quiet investigation into his own finances and discovered a reality that was as old as the country itself. His management team, the men who stood safely outside the ropes wearing tailored suits, were systematically stealing his earnings. They were pocketing the majority of his prize money, treating him not as an athlete, but as livestock. The trauma of the Mississippi prison farms had taught Willie many things, but submission was not one of them. He was not a man who would allow himself to be robbed to his face. He demanded a meeting. He marched into the office of the Illinois Boxing Commissioner, confronting his managers directly. The managers, accustomed to dealing with desperate, easily intimidated fighters, attempted to brush him off. They underestimated the towering, furious man standing before them. The argument escalated rapidly. Words failed, and Willie resorted to the exact skill they had hired him for. The confrontation exploded into a physical brawl right inside the commissioner's office. Furniture was smashed, and Willie physically dismantled the men who had stolen his sweat and blood. The establishment's retaliation was swift and unforgiving. The Boxing Commission suspended Willie Dixon from fighting for 6 months. His managers were permanently expelled from the sport for their corruption, but the damage to Willie's career was fatal. He was branded as uncontrollable, a troublemaker who refused to play by the unspoken rules of exploitation. His athletic dream was dead, but this violent end to his boxing career provided the most vital education of his life. He learned that talent, whether physical or artistic, is entirely useless if you do not control the business apparatus surrounding it. The men in the suits were always the true opponents. It was during his final bitter days, training at the local gymnasium that a seemingly inconsequential encounter altered the trajectory of modern music. Willie met a local piano player named Leonard Baby Doo Caston. Caston was a sharp, observant musician who frequented the gym. He watched Willie train, listened to him sing spirituals while hitting the heavy bag, and recognized a raw, untapped musical genius. Caston knew that Willie was broke and disillusioned with boxing. He also knew that Willie understood the complex vocal harmonies of the gospel quartets he had sung with back in Vicksburg. Caston approached Willie with a proposition. If Willie could sing the bass line, he could surely play it. But Willie could not afford an upright bass, an expensive and cumbersome instrument. Caston, utilizing the ingenuity born of poverty, offered a solution. He found a massive tin can, the kind used to hold bulk cooking oil, attached a long wooden pole to it, and ran a single thick wire string down the center. It was a crude, homemade instrument known as a washtub bass or a tin can bass. When Caston handed this makeshift contraption to the giant ex-boxer, something clicked. Willie grasped the pole, plucked the single string, and felt the deep, resonant vibration travel up his arm. Because he already possessed a profound internal understanding of rhythm and harmony from his mother's rhymes and the gospel choirs, he did not need to learn musical theory. He applied his vocal knowledge directly to the single string, shifting the pitch by bending the pole. Within weeks, he had mastered the instrument. The rhythm of the dirt had found a physical voice. By 1939, Dixon and Caston formalized their partnership. They formed a vocal and instrumental group called the Five Breezes. Their sound was a sophisticated blend of traditional blues, the emerging urban jazz, and tight, complex vocal harmonies. They were good enough to catch the attention of the Bluebird label, recording 8 tracks in 1940. Willie Dixon was officially a working musician. He was making a living without taking punches to the face. But history was rapidly closing in. The United States entered the Second World War. The federal government initiated a massive draft, calling millions of young men to the front lines to fight the fascist regimes of Europe and Imperial Japan. Willie Dixon received his draft notice. For many Black Americans, the war presented an agonizing paradox. They were being asked to bleed and die for a country that actively denied them basic human rights, enforced segregation by law, and tolerated the lynching of their people. The government launched the Double V campaign, Victory Abroad Against Fascism and Victory at Home Against Racism, to encourage Black enlistment. Most complied, hoping their sacrifice would earn them equality. Willie Dixon looked at the hypocrisy and refused. He declared himself a conscientious objector, but his objection was not based on religious pacifism. It was based on cold, irrefutable logic. He stood before the draft board and delivered a statement of staggering courage and clarity. Why should I go to work to save somebody else when the people I'm living with are killing me every day? He asked. I will not fight for a nation where racist laws are still in place. Why should I lay down my life overseas for freedom when I do not even have the right to vote in Mississippi? In the hyper-patriotic fever of the 1940s, this was a profoundly dangerous stance. Draft evasion was a federal crime. For a Black man to publicly accuse the United States government of systemic racism while refusing to serve was tantamount to treason in the eyes of the establishment. The government did not hesitate. Willie Dixon was arrested, prosecuted, and sentenced to prison. For 10 months, the giant was locked in a cage. The trauma of his teenage years on the Mississippi prison farms came rushing back. He was once again stripped of his agency, locked away by a system that demanded his obedience or his liberty. But this imprisonment was fundamentally different. He was not in jail on a fabricated charge of vagrancy. He was in jail because he possessed an unshakable moral spine. He used the time to harden his resolve. He wrote lyrics in his head, refining his ability to compress the vast, infuriating complexities of the world into sharp, biting rhymes. When he walked out of that prison, he was no longer just a musician trying to make a buck. He was a man who had stared down the full weight of the United States government and refused to blink. Upon his release in the mid-1940s, he immediately returned to the only thing that made sense: the music. The Chicago scene was beginning to shift. The acoustic, rural blues brought up by the early migrants was no longer loud enough to cut through the noise of the city clubs. The music was getting faster, harder, and electrified. Willie formed a new group, the Four Jumps of Jive, in 1945. Shortly after, he reunited with Leonard Caston to form the Big Three Trio. The Big Three Trio was a significant step forward. They secured a professional recording contract with Columbia Records in 1947. Their music was polished, blending pop sensibilities with blues undertones. They wore sharp suits, played upscale clubs, and started making real money. Willie finally bought a real professional upright acoustic bass. His physical presence on stage was magnetic. He slapped the heavy strings with the raw power of a heavyweight boxer, creating a percussive, driving rhythm that forced the audience to move. But the polished club gigs were only his day job. Deep in the night, after the Big Three Trio finished their sets, Willie would pack up his bass and head deeper into the South Side. He frequented the rough, smoky taverns where the true, unfiltered sound of Chicago was being forged. These were the late-night jam sessions, the laboratories where the electric blues was being invented. It was in these sweaty, crowded rooms that Willie crossed paths with a young, intense slide guitarist who had also come up from the Mississippi Delta. His name was McKinley Morganfield, but the world would soon know him as Muddy Waters. Muddy was playing a raw, aggressive, deeply Southern style of blues, but he was plugging his guitar into an amplifier to slice through the crowd noise. Willie listened to Muddy play and recognized the ghosts of the prison farms. He heard the dirt. He realized that the polished pop blues of the Big Three Trio was not the future. The future was this loud, electric, unapologetic sound. As the 1940s drew to a close, Willie Dixon stood at a critical intersection. He had survived the brutality of the South, the corruption of the boxing ring, and the cages of the federal government. He understood the mechanics of rhythm, the power of lyricism, and the absolute necessity of controlling his own labor. He was no longer a victim of circumstance. He was a deeply cynical, fiercely intelligent musician waiting for the right machinery to build his empire. That machinery was currently operating out of a small, disorganized storefront on the South Side, run by two immigrant brothers who were about to change the world and who were about to realize they desperately needed an architect. Willie Dixon's journey through the 1940s was a masterclass in survival through adaptation. He learned that the physical power that won him boxing championships was useless against a rigged contract. He learned that the moral clarity that sent him to prison was a lonely, punishing road. As he transitioned from the tin can bass to the polished stages of Columbia Records, he was quietly assembling the psychological toolkit he would need for the coming decades. He was observing how the industry functioned, how publishers extracted wealth from artists, and how the raw pain of the Black American experience was being packaged and sold. He was preparing himself not just to play the blues, but to engineer it. The era of the performer was ending. The era of the invisible architect was about to begin. The history of American music is not merely a chronicle of talented artists standing in front of microphones. It is fundamentally a history of real estate and contract law. As the 1950s commenced, the epicenter of the emerging urban blues sound was not a grand concert hall, but a cramped, disorganized storefront at 2120 South Michigan Avenue in Chicago. This was the headquarters of Aristocrat Records, soon to be immortalized as Chess Records. It was run by Leonard and Phil Chess, two Polish-Jewish immigrant brothers who understood the ruthless mechanics of the street hustler. They were not musicians. They were businessmen operating on the fringes of the recording industry, recognizing that the rapidly expanding Black population of Chicago represented a massive, untapped consumer market. They needed raw material to press into vinyl, and they found it in the desperate, immensely talented Southern migrants pouring into the city. But the Chess brothers quickly encountered a logistical nightmare. They had the recording equipment and the distribution network, but they lacked the musical vocabulary to organize the chaotic brilliance of the artists they were signing. They needed an architect. In 1948, the Chess brothers hired Willie Dixon as a session bassist for a recording by slide guitarist Robert Nighthawk. It was intended to be a simple transactional arrangement. But the moment Dixon stepped into the studio, the power dynamic fundamentally shifted. Dixon was not just a man holding a large wooden instrument. He brought with him the relentless discipline he had learned from the gospel quartets, the structural understanding of rhythm forged on the Mississippi prison farms, and a ferocious intellect that immediately grasped the technical aspects of audio production. The Chess brothers watched as this towering giant casually stepped in and began organizing the session, instructing the musicians on timing, tightening the arrangements, and commanding a level of respect from the artists that the white owners could never achieve. By 1951, Aristocrat had rebranded as Chess Records, and Willie Dixon was hired as a full-time employee. Officially, his contract classified him as a recording artist. In reality, he became the engine that drove the entire operation. To call Willie Dixon a producer or a session musician is a gross understatement. He was the invisible machinery of the Chess empire. He played the upright bass on virtually every significant track recorded in that room. He scouted the rough South Side clubs at night, identifying new talent and bringing them to the label. He acted as the A&R director, the arranger, the mediator, and the musical director. But his most vital, history-altering role was that of the songwriter. Willie Dixon possessed a unique, almost psychological approach to writing music. He did not simply write a catchy melody and hand it to whoever was available. He engineered songs to fit the specific psychological profile of the artist standing in the vocal booth. He was a tailor crafting bespoke suits of armor for men who had spent their lives being told they were worthless. Consider Muddy Waters. Muddy was a man who projected an aura of absolute unyielding authority. He was deeply steeped in the folklore and mysticism of the Deep South. Dixon observed this and wrote a song that weaponized Muddy's persona. In 1954, he handed Muddy the lyrics and the unmistakable stuttering rhythm of Hoochie Coochie Man. The song was not merely a blues track. It was a declaration of mythological supremacy. With lyrics boasting of voodoo charms, black cat bones, and unstoppable virility, it tapped into a deep vein of black Southern folklore that the Northern audiences were starved for. Dixon understood that these men, stripped of political and economic power, required cultural avenues to assert their masculinity and dominance. Hoochie Coochie Man provided that avenue. It sold over 75,000 copies, fundamentally transforming Muddy Waters from a local club act into a national icon. Dixon followed this psychological blueprint with a string of masterpieces tailored for Muddy, including I Just Want to Make Love to You and You Need Love. Then there was Howlin' Wolf. If Muddy Waters was the regal king of the Chicago blues, Howlin' Wolf was its terrifying, volatile force of nature. Standing 6'3" and weighing near 300 pounds, Wolf possessed a voice that sounded like tearing metal and an intensely competitive, suspicious nature. He and Muddy were fierce rivals, constantly vying for the top position at Chess Records. Dixon brilliantly played this rivalry to the label's advantage. He understood that Wolf's power lay in his menace. Dixon wrote Spoonful specifically for him. He took a mundane kitchen utensil and, through sharp, repetitive lyricism, transformed it into a dark symbol of obsessive, dangerous desire, whether for sex, drugs, or power. He wrote Evil, Backdoor Man, and Wang Dang Doodle. Wolf, notoriously stubborn, frequently argued with Dixon in the studio, resenting the fact that he was singing another man's words. But Wolf recorded them anyway, because he possessed the sharp instincts of a survivor, and he knew a hit record when he heard one. Dixon's architectural brilliance extended beyond the established bluesman. He penned the smash hit My Babe for the brilliant, deeply troubled harmonica player Little Walter, giving Walter his first #1 hit on the R&B charts. But perhaps the most profound yet under-acknowledged aspect of Dixon's tenure at Chess was his role in the literal birth of rock and roll. When a young, ambitious guitar player from St. Louis named Chuck Berry arrived at the studio with a fast-paced, country-influenced tune, the Chess brothers were unsure of what to do with it. It was Willie Dixon who stood behind Berry in the recording booth, his massive hands slapping the strings of the upright bass, laying down the relentless driving backbeat that transformed the song into Maybelline. As Berry practically invented the vocabulary of the electric guitar on Trey, CKs like Sweet Little 16 and Johnny B. Good, the foundational pulse of the music, the heavy, swinging rhythm that forced teenagers to dance, was being generated by Willie Dixon. He was the bridge connecting the rural sorrow of the Delta to the electric rebellion of teenage America. Yet, as the records flew off the shelves and the money poured into the bank accounts of 2120 South Michigan Avenue, the brutal reality of the music industry's racial economics began to suffocate him. The exploitation Willie Dixon faced at Chess Records was not an anomaly. It was the standard operating procedure of the mid-century recording industry, a system fundamentally designed to extract intellectual property from black creators while shielding the profits behind impenetrable walls of legal jargon. The Chess brothers recognized Dixon's staggering value, but they paid him a meager salary of $100 a week. For a man trying to support a rapidly expanding family in an increasingly expensive city, this was a starvation wage disguised as steady employment, but the salary was merely the surface of the theft. The true devastation lay in the publishing rights. In the music business, wealth is not generated by the one-time sale of a record. It is generated by the underlying copyright of the composition. Every time a song is played on the radio, covered by another artist, or used in a film, the publisher and the songwriter are owed royalties. The men in the suits understood this mathematics perfectly. The artists, largely uneducated in the intricacies of copyright law, did not. The Chess brothers established their own publishing company, Arc Music. They would offer Dixon a flat fee, often as little as $30, to outright purchase the copyright to his songs. Faced with immediate bills and the threat of unemployment, Dixon was routinely forced to sign away the rights to masterpieces that would go on to generate millions of dollars. The architecture he was building did not belong to him. He was a sharecropper on a vinyl plantation. The psychological trauma of this realization was profound. Willie Dixon was not a naive teenager. He was a fiercely intelligent man who had gone to federal prison for his principles. He knew exactly what was happening to him. He was watching the men in the front office buy luxury cars and suburban mansions using the wealth generated by his mother's rhymes and his own traumatic history. The system was cruel because it was perfectly legal. It utilized contracts, advances, and the desperate economic reality of the black working class to ensure that the creators of the culture never actually owned it. By the late 1950s, the resentment reached a boiling point. Dixon could no longer tolerate the financial asphyxiation at Chess. He made a bold, defiant move, leaving the label to join a smaller rival independent outfit called Cobra Records. At Cobra, Dixon was given a freer hand. He immediately began defining a new, more visceral subgenre known as the West Side Sound. He discovered and produced young, explosive guitarists like Otis Rush, Buddy Guy, and Magic Sam. The music was darker, more aggressive, utilizing minor keys and heavy vibrato. Dixon was proving once again that he could build a successful sonic empire anywhere he went. But Cobra Records was undercapitalized and plagued by mismanagement and rumored connections to organized crime. The label eventually collapsed, filing for bankruptcy and leaving its artists stranded. Willie Dixon found himself standing on the street, his brief taste of artistic independence shattered by the cold realities of corporate finance. He had a family to feed, rent to pay, and no viable outlet for his work. He was forced into the most humiliating compromise of his life. Swallowing his pride, he walked back through the doors of Chess Records in 1960. He returned to the men who had systematically robbed him, not out of loyalty, but out of absolute economic coercion. He was backside on the factory, forced to resume building the empire that he would never be allowed to rule. But the landscape of music was about to undergo a seismic shift. The songs he had sold for $30 were about to cross the Atlantic Ocean, landing in the hands of skinny working-class teenagers in England who were preparing to sell Willie Dixon's trauma back to white America at a staggering premium. The return to Chess Records marked a dark, cynical period in Willie Dixon's life. He had learned the ultimate crushing lesson of mid-century capitalism. Genius is entirely subordinate to leverage. You can write the soundtrack of a generation, but if you do not own the paper it is printed on, you are merely a well-compensated slave to the machinery. Dixon sat in the studios of the South Side, grinding out hits, watching the 1950s bleed into a new volatile decade. He believed his role was permanently fixed as the invisible man in the shadows, the uncredited laborer of the blues. But he could not have anticipated the cultural explosion brewing in the port cities of the United Kingdom. He did not know that his lyrics had become a sacred text for a new breed of rock and roll revolutionaries, and he did not know that these young British musicians were about to force his name out of the fine print and onto the grandest stages of the world. By 1960, the internal mechanics of the American music industry had engineered a cynical paradox. The Chicago blues, a sound forged from the specific, localized suffering of Black Americans in the Jim Crow South and the urban North, was slowly losing its domestic audience. Black youth in America were turning their radios toward Detroit, where Motown was producing an upbeat, polished, and impeccably choreographed sound of upward mobility. The raw, jagged edges of the Mississippi Delta were beginning to feel like a relic of a painful past that the new generation wanted to leave behind. Willie Dixon sat in the studios of Chess Records, a middle-aged D-man trapped in an exploitative contract, grinding out sessions for a domestic market that was steadily shrinking. He had no way of knowing that the brutal, hyper-local trauma he had compressed into his lyrics had bypassed the American mainstream entirely and struck a nerve on a different continent. Following the devastation of the Second World War, the United Kingdom was a landscape of bombed-out cities, rationing, and gray, suffocating austerity. The working-class teenagers of port cities like Liverpool, Newcastle, and London were desperate for a cultural escape from the rubble. They found it in the luggage of merchant seamen returning from the United States who brought back heavy 78 RPM vinyl records stamped with the Chess logo. When these British youths dropped the needle on a Muddy Waters or Howlin' Wolf track, they did not hear a quaint foreign folk tradition. They heard a visceral, uncompromising rebellion. They heard the sound of men who possessed nothing, yet projected absolute authority. And the name printed in the parentheses beneath almost every title that captured their imagination was W. Dixon. To this generation of British teenagers, Willie Dixon was not an underpaid session musician. He was the primary author of a sacred text. They formed bands and began meticulously dissecting his arrangements. They lacked the lived experience of the Mississippi penal farms, but they adopted the aggressive posture of Dixon's characters as a weapon against their own class rigidities. In 1962, a German concert promoter named Horst Lippmann recognized this simmering European obsession and orchestrated a logistical miracle. He launched the American Folk Blues Festival, an ambitious project designed to bring the undisputed titans of the blues across the Atlantic for a grueling multi-country tour. Lippmann understood that managing a group of fiercely independent, competitive, and often volatile bluesmen was an impossible task for a European outsider. He needed an inside, an enforcer, and an architect. He hired Willie Dixon to assemble the talent, manage the money, and serve as the musical director. When Willie Dixon stepped off the airplane in Europe, he braced himself for the same psychological combat he endured every day in America. He expected to be directed to service elevators, to be barred from restaurants, and to endure the casual daily degradations that defined the Black American experience. Instead, he encountered a reality that induced a profound psychological shock. In Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, there were no colored-only signs. The European promoters and audiences did not view these men as a marginalized underclass or mere tavern entertainers. They treated them as visiting maestros, the classical composers of a distinctly American art form. When Willie Dixon walked into a hotel, he walked through the front door. He was addressed with deference, referred to as Mr. Dixon, and asked serious analytical questions about the structure and history of his music by journalists and intellectuals. For a man who had spent 47 years building a defensive armor against systemic racial terror, this sudden influx of unconditional respect was disorienting. It forced a painful internal reckoning. The American system of racism was so economically efficient because it relied on breaking the psychological spirit of its workforce. If you tell a man he is worthless every day of his life, it is much easier to steal his labor. In Europe, Dixon saw the undeniable proof that his subjugation was not a natural order, but a deliberate geographic construct. The trauma of the trip was not in how he was treated, but in the devastating realization of what he had been denied his entire life. He wept in European hotel rooms, not from sadness, but from the crushing weight of suddenly being recognized as a human being. It was during these tours that the blueprint of modern rock and roll was physically handed over. In 1963, Dixon Vesey guided the Crawdaddy Club in Richmond, a suburb of London. He was introduced to a local rhythm and blues band consisting of impossibly skinny, pale teenagers with shaggy hair. They called themselves the Rolling Stones. The young men were completely starstruck, sitting at the feet of the giant from Vicksburg. Dixon's response to these aspiring musicians is a crucial indicator of his character. A lesser man, hardened by decades of corporate theft, might have guarded his knowledge jealously. But Dixon operated on a higher moral frequency. He viewed the blues not as a proprietary asset to be hoarded, but as a shared language of the dispossessed. He sat with Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, and Brian Jones, and he taught them. He demonstrated how to manipulate the tempo to build tension, how to structure a turnaround, and how to deliver a lyric with the necessary menace. He even wrote down chord progressions and handed them cassette tapes of unreleased material so they could practice. He gave away the structural secrets of the blues with the generosity of a master teacher thrilled to find eager students. He did this because he could not fathom the macroeconomic shift that was about to occur. Within 2 years, the Rolling Stones would take Dixon's song, Little Red Rooster, a slow, grinding country blues, and push it to the #1 spot on the UK singles chart. Soon after, the power trio Cream, featuring Eric Clapton, would take Dixon's Spoonful and stretch it into a 16-minute ear-shattering epic of psychedelic rock, selling millions of albums globally. The British invasion was a cultural phenomenon, but economically, it was an unprecedented scaling up of the same old exploitation. The European youth were buying the records by the millions, generating a tsunami of mechanical and performance royalties. But the legal architecture established in the 1950s held firm. Every time a British rock band recorded a Willie Dixon song, the royalties flowed across the Atlantic, bypassing Dixon's mailbox entirely, and landing squarely in the bank accounts of Arc Music, the publishing arm owned by the Chess brothers. The machinery of extraction was functioning perfectly. White British kids were performing the trauma of a black Mississippi laborer, and the white American executives were collecting the profits. Dixon returned to Chicago, his music conquering the globe, and resumed his $100 a week job in the studio. However, by the late 1960s, the factory was beginning to crumble. The Cultural Revolution had altered the sonic landscape. The raw, acoustic, upright bass that Dixon had utilized to drive the rhythm of the 1950s was deemed obsolete by the label executives. They wanted the loud, sustained thud of the Fender electric bass. Dixon, an acoustic purist who relied on the physical slap of the strings against the wood to create his signature percussive drive, found himself increasingly sidelined in his own studio. The Chess brothers, desperate to tap into the lucrative counterculture market, forced their aging bluesmen to record bizarre psychedelic albums covered in fuzz pedals and wah-wah effects. Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf hated the new direction, and Dixon recognized it as the desperate flailing of a company that had lost its compass. The final collapse was swift and absolute. The men who had built the Chicago sound alongside Dixon began to die. Little Walter, the fiery harmonica genius, died from injuries sustained in a street fight. Sonny Boy Williamson passed away. The lifestyle of cheap liquor, relentless touring, and profound financial stress was collecting its toll. Then, in October 1969, Leonard Chess, the ruthless patriarch of the label, died suddenly of a massive heart attack in his car. Within months of Leonard's death, the Chess family sold the company to a corporate conglomerate that manufactured magnetic tape. The executives who took over had no understanding of the blues, no connection to the artists, and no interest in maintaining the ramshackle storefront on South Michigan Avenue. The studio was closed. The catalogs were absorbed into corporate portfolios. The empire was dismantled. Willie Dixon was now 54 years old. The studio doors were locked, the executives were gone, and the British rock stars he had tutored were playing to stadiums of 50,000 people. He had spent 20 years as the invisible architect, the ghost in the machine, building careers for everyone but himself. But Dixon possessed a profound instinct for survival. He looked at the wreckage of Chess Records and realized a fundamental truth. The era of the backroom fixer was over. If he wanted to survive the coming decade, he had to own his face, his voice, and his legacy. He gathered the remaining elite session musicians from the old days and formed a touring band, the Chicago Blues All-Stars. He signed a recording contract with Columbia Records, but this time he refused to stand in the shadows. In 1970, he released a studio album where he stepped up to the primary microphone and sang the songs he had written for Muddy, Wolf, and Walter. He titled the album with a declarative, undeniable statement of fact: "I am the blues." The giant had finally stepped out of the building, but as he prepared to take his rightful place on the stage, he began quietly compiling a meticulous, devastating paper trail. The era of physical violence and studio exploitation was over. Willie Dixon was preparing for a new kind of war, and his battlefield was going to be the federal courts. Stepping into the spotlight in his mid-50s was not an act of vanity. It was a tactical maneuver. Willie Dixon understood that the legal system only recognized and protected those who possessed visible, undeniable leverage. By touring Europe and establishing himself as a front-facing artist, he was generating the capital and the public profile necessary to fund a siege. He had survived the prison farms, the boxing commissioners, the draft, boards, and the recording executives. He had watched millions of dollars generated by his own intellect flow into the pockets of men who had never worked a day in the dirt. As the 1970s dawned, Dixon looked at the sprawling multi-billion-dollar rock industry that had been built directly on top of his blueprints. He was no longer a victim seeking a handout. He was the architect, and he was coming to collect the rent. The 1970s marked a radical transformation in the global music economy. Rock and roll was no longer a rebellious subculture played in sweaty clubs. It had metastasized into a multi-billion-dollar corporate industry. Bands like Led Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones, and the Doors were not merely musicians. They were multinational conglomerates. They filled massive outdoor stadiums, traveled in private jets, and generated wealth on a scale previously unimaginable in the entertainment sector. Yet the foundational architecture of this massive economic engine remained completely hidden. The staggering profits of stadium rock were built directly atop the rhythmic structures and lyrical blueprints drafted by a black man from Mississippi who was currently touring small European theaters just to keep his lights on. As Willie Dixon entered his 60s, he confronted a deeply ingrained, highly profitable myth perpetuated by the white rock establishment. It was the myth of the anonymous bluesman. When British and American rock bands lifted entire verses, guitar riffs, and vocal melodies from the Chess catalog, they frequently justified the theft by claiming the blues was simply folk music. They argued it was a public domain resource, a cultural soup floating in the Delta air, belonging to everyone and no one. This was not a harmless misunderstanding. It was a calculated legal defense. By erasing the individual genius of the black songwriter, the rock industry absolved itself of the legal obligation to pay royalties. They stripped Willie Dixon of his authorship to PRA. Tech their profit margins. But Dixon was not a ghost, and he was not an anonymous field worker. He was a highly methodical, intensely disciplined composer. He knew exactly what he had written, down to the syllable. For decades, he had swallowed his rage, constrained by poverty, racist legal systems, and the immediate need to feed his children. But in the 1970s, the dynamic changed. By fronting the Chicago Blues All-Stars and relentlessly touring, Dixon finally achieved a degree of financial stability. He was no longer a desperate session player trapped in a $100-a-week contract. He had the resources to hire lawyers. The era of physical brawls in boxing commission offices was over. The giant was preparing for a paper war, and he intended to dismantle the architecture of his exploitation brick by brick. His first target was the source of his deepest trauma, Ark Music. This was the publishing company set up by the Chess brothers, the entity that had systematically purchased his copyrights for $30 a song. The Chess brothers were gone, but Ark Music was still collecting the massive mechanical royalties generated by the British invasion. Suing a major publishing firm in 1977 was an incredibly dangerous maneuver for a legacy black artist. The legal system was notoriously hostile, designed to favor corporations with endless capital to drag out litigation until the plaintiff went bankrupt. Dixon partnered with a brilliant, aggressive attorney named Scott Cameron. Together, they did not just file a lawsuit, they launched a forensic audit. They dug through decades of convoluted contracts, unearthing the deliberate, systemic obfuscation used to trick Dixon out of his intellectual property. The litigation was grueling. It required Dixon to revisit the most humiliating compromises of his life, examining the documents where he had signed away his genius to keep his family off the street. But he did not flinch. He sat in depositions, a towering, immovable force, and systematically dismantled the publishing company's defense. The strategy worked. In a landmark victory that sent shockwaves through the recording industry, Ark Music surrendered. They agreed to an out-of-court settlement, but the money, while substantial, was secondary. The true victory was the return of the paper. Willie Dixon reclaimed the copyrights to his entire catalog. The songs belonged to him again. He established his own publishing company, Hoochie Coochie Music. For the first time in his life, the invisible architect owned the deeds to his own buildings. However, regaining his catalog from Ark Music only solved the internal theft. He still had to address the external piracy. He had to confront the rock stars who had built their empires on his uncredited labor. This brought him to the doorstep of the biggest band on the planet, Led Zeppelin. In 1969, Led Zeppelin released their second album, Led Zeppelin II. The opening track was a thunderous, sexually charged anthem called Whole Lotta Love. It became one of the most famous rock songs in history, propelling the band to global superstardom. But the lyrics, the specific visceral pleas of way down inside, and the structural cadence of the vocal delivery were not written by lead singer Robert Plant. They were lifted directly from a song titled You Need Love, written by Willie Dixon in 1962 and originally recorded by Muddy Waters. For over a decade, Led Zeppelin collected millions of dollars in royalties for Whole Lotta Love, crediting the composition entirely to themselves. They relied on the old myth, the assumption that an aging bluesman would not have the legal sophistication, the financial backing, or the sheer audacity to sue a corporate rock behemoth. They underestimated the man from Vicksburg. In 1985, Willie Dixon sued Led Zeppelin for copyright infringement. The case became a defining moment in the history of music law. Zeppelin's defense team initially attempted to argue that the lyrics were PRT of the traditional blues lexicon, a generic cultural expression. Dixon's legal team ruthlessly dismantled this argument. They laid the two tracks side by side. The plagiarism was not an homage. It was a direct, undeniable transfer of intellectual property. Robert Plant later admitted in interviews that he had simply borrowed the lyrics. Assuming no one would care, faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of a devastating public trial, Led Zeppelin capitulated, settling out of court for an undisclosed, highly lucrative sum. However, Dixon's ultimate prize was not financial compensation, it was historical truth. He forced the rock giants to permanently alter their own legacy, ensuring his name was carved directly into their platinum records. Future pressings of Led Zeppelin II carried a new line of text beneath the title of their biggest hit, written by Jimmy Page, Robert Plant, John Paul Jones, John Bonham, and Willie Dixon. It was a permanent historical correction. Dixon forced the white rock establishment to publicly acknowledge their architect. These legal victories were monumental, but they came at the tail end of a life defined by immense physical stress. The human body is a ledger, and it keeps a meticulous record of trauma, overwork, and systemic neglect. The grueling poverty of his youth, the brutal labor on the prison farms, the violent impacts of the boxing ring, and decades of relentless grinding tour schedules finally caught up with him. Willie Dixon developed severe diabetes. The disease ravaged his massive frame. By the late 1980s, the circulation in his right leg failed completely. The man who had once won the Golden Gloves, who had stood like a titan in the chess studios driving the rhythm of a generation, was forced onto an operating table. His right leg was amputated. For many men, this physical devastation would signal the end. It would be the final crushing blow that forced a retreat into quiet retirement. But Willie Dixon's mind remained razor sharp, and his sense of mission only intensified. He viewed the amputation not as a defeat, but as a minor logistical inconvenience. He simply acquired a motorized wheelchair, adapted his upright bass so he could play it while seated, and rolled right back onto the stage. He refused to let the industry see him broken. More importantly, the loss of his leg clarified his ultimate purpose. He realized his time was finite. He had won his personal battles. He had secured his copyrights and forced the rock gods to pay their debts. But he looked at the generations of blues musicians behind him, men and women who were aging in poverty, who had signed the same predatory contracts he had, but who lacked the ferocity and the resources to fight back. He knew that if he did not institutionalize his knowledge, the cycle of extraction would simply repeat itself. In 1982, utilizing the settlement funds from his legal victories, he founded the Blues Heaven Foundation. This was his true masterpiece. It was not a charity designed to hand out small, patronizing grants. It was an aggressive, highly focused advocacy group built to function as a legal and educational shield for exploited artists. Dixon mandated that the foundation's primary mission was royalty recovery. He hired lawyers to track down the stolen intellectual property of his peers, fighting to get their names properly credited and their unpaid royalties delivered. He provided financial assistance for emergency medical care and funeral expenses for bluesmen who had generated millions for record labels but were dying penniless. Furthermore, he set up scholarship programs for young musicians, ensuring they were educated not just in chords and scales, but in the ruthless mechanics of copyright law, publishing contracts, and intellectual property rights. He was arming the next generation. The crowning achievement of the Blues Heaven Foundation was a profound act of geographic and historical reclamation. In the late 1990s, spearheaded by Dixon's widow Marie and his family, the foundation purchased the building at 2120 South Michigan Avenue. They bought the old Chess Records studio, the space where Willie Dixon was systematically underpaid, where his copyrights were stripped away and where he was treated as an invisible laborer, was now legally owned by his family and his foundation. They transformed the factory of exploitation into a museum and a sanctuary. The architect had finally bought the building. Willie Dixon did not live to see the final purchase of the chess building, but he lived long enough to witness the world finally bow to his genius. In 1989, he released his final album, Hidden Charms. It won the Grammy Award for Best Traditional Blues Album. He was inducted into the Blues Hall of Fame and later the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The institutions that had ignored him for decades were forced to cement his name in their highest echelons. On January 29, 1992, in Burbank, California, the heavy machinery finally stopped. Willie